I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings. Are we in possession of scientific proof that the human being is evolving much more rapidly than we ever would have thought possible? Is the DNA molecule now being re-envisioned as something that is in a constant dynamic interchange with its own environment? Are there scientific discoveries that actually prove that DNA changes in response to stress? Could stressful experiences that we are going through as a planet right now actually be causing mass evolution to occur? And is this part of the ascension process? Are these earth changes and these political upheavals and these social breakdowns all part of an operative stress that is kickstarting our own ascension and evolution? That's what we're going to be addressing in this episode of Wisdom Teachings. We've been looking at some pretty amazing information that absolutely is a game changer. As we were just saying here in the studio on break, this is Star Trek technology. Somebody beaming this little device over your bone when it's broken and the bone heals. I don't think Ighena's technology worked quite that fast, but we're certainly taking steps in that direction. And the really sad part is that Ighena was a colleague of one of the greatest scientific rock stars of the 20th century, the founding father of radio. His discoveries, his inventions are seen all over the place, anywhere there's a radio antenna. So why did we not then take his protege's work seriously, especially because of the awesome implications of it? What we're seeing is that the emperor has no clothes in biological science. There's some very important pieces missing. We've taken a reductionist, materialistic view of what life is. We have denied the life force. We have denied the intrinsic power of the universe to make life out of energy, which otherwise we would normally think is not alive. Quantum mechanics itself contains the secret ingredients that make all of this possible. So the more that the data stacks up, the more that we have a cosmic pancake breakfast of amazingness that's bringing us right back to that surfeit of wealth, of great information. It's almost too much to take in. There's so much stuff going on. Let me find my clicker here and then we'll get back into that. Here we go. We saw the salamander eggs zapped into frog eggs, transforming those frog eggs into salamanders. No remnant of having been from a frog. We saw Professor Kongang from Korea, South Korea that is, zapping ducks in this weird box, the photons being released going through these copper pipes into this room where there's a pregnant chicken, and as those eggs hatch, 80% of them have this weird duck-like appearance. They still have some chicken characteristics, but that is not what should come out of a chicken's egg. It looks a lot more like a duck than a chicken, and he also was able to do the same kind of weird stuff, taking corn and blending it with wheat. And then in our last episode, we saw the Italian scientist Ighena, who actually took a magnetic field oscillator he invented and zapped apricots while they were on the branches of an apricot tree and transformed them into apples. And it only took 16 days. It shouldn't even be possible for apricots to change genetically that fast, but this was witnessed, this was documented, and that's why in Italy he is considered the Italian Tesla. And of course, we also talked about how he was able to zap the tail of a rat, which otherwise was naked and small, and the tail became much larger when he zapped it with the vibrations from a cat, thus leading to a cat-like tail and the death of the rat. And this led him to make that bone healing discovery where he took energy from healthy bones and zapped those vibrations into a broken bone, in this case in a rabbit's foot, and the bone heals much faster than it's supposed to. Now this brings us to the new information, because that's what you want. So let's get right into it. I want to talk to you about the fact that there is compelling scientific proof that the genetic code is not locked up in DNA. Geneticists normally don't like this, so when something happens that tips the apple cart, it gets a lot of attention. Well, we're going to talk specifically now about the discoveries of Dr. Robert Pruitt, who is working with the humble Arabidopsis mustard weed. This is the classic plant that everybody uses in laboratory biological research on plants. And of course, if you don't already know this, It is the mustard plant that has been genetically modified through hybridization techniques into a variety of the things that we love to eat in the veggie aisle. So mustard has been adapted into kale, mustard has been adapted into broccoli, mustard has been adapted into kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, and even the broccoli rabe. All of those things are just variations of the mustard weed. So let's now take a look at what happened with Dr. Robert Pruitt experimenting with the mustard plant in his lab, one of the top geneticists in the world on this subject. He found it was self-correcting. So this is Dr. Robert Pruitt. And again, at some point we really need to get all these guys together and get them all arguing about how this fits together. This is from the New York Times, March 23rd, 2005. Startling the scientists, a plant fixes its own flawed genes. And then it says here that geneticists at Purdue University found plants possessing a corrected version of a defective gene they inherited from both of their parents, as if there was a handy backup copy with the right version that was already existing somewhere. This finding implies some organisms may contain a cryptic backup copy of their genome, bypassing the usual mechanisms of heredity. If confirmed, this would represent an unprecedented exception to the laws of inheritance discovered by Gregor Mendel in the 19th century. Equally surprising, the cryptic genome appears not to be made of DNA, the standard hereditary material. Oh, you see what's going on though? They got to have something material. They got to have a backup copy. There's got to be this other gene. Well, it's not DNA, but it's got to be something physical. Now, I'm not dissing Robert Pruitt here. I'm just saying that this is the result of our Western science not hearing about what happened in Russia, not hearing about Igina, where he discovered that you have vibrational atoms that are not really atoms, but they're something else. They're sort of magnetic and they're sort of energetic, and they underlie life. We've heard from Gary Yaev. He calls them supergenes, bioenergetics. It is not anything that you're going to find in the cells. It's a field outside the cells. It's a living energy that's all around us. So they don't know how to explain this, but they found it, and this is what's so strange. So the first scientist who weighs in with very credible endorsement of this is Dr. Elliot Meyerowitz, and he is one of the leading geneticists in the world who weighs in on this at the New York Times article, as you see right here, where he said, it looks like a marvelous discovery. And he's at California Institute of Technology working on plant genetics. So right there, for someone of that caliber to say this is a marvelous discovery, you can't deny how powerful that is. That's an incredible endorsement. And again, all of this is going to ultimately relate back to humans, because what are the missing codes in our own DNA? What are the things that we need to become psychic, to have telekinesis, to levitate, to see into the future? Could those things be missing, and could there be ways in which they will be repaired energetically as we go through this process as a planet, as a solar system? Absolutely, I believe the answer is yes. Now let's go on. Dr. David Haig, who we're going to see in just a second, is another one of the top evolutionary biologists in the world from Harvard University, and he described this as a really strange and unexpected result, which would be important if it holds up and applies widely in nature. So this is Dr. David Haig, Harvard University, tenured professor, top geneticist, saying this is a very compelling, strange discovery, a game changer. So now I'm going to read you part of what was said in this New York Times article, so you understand again, I'm not making this up. This is not pseudoscience. I consider myself like a painter, and my canvas is scientific discoveries, and you just have to take these things and put them together and look at the big picture. There's a model hiding in here that nobody really seems to get the whole thing, but they get pieces of it. So these guys are finding a compelling discovery, but they don't really understand what it is. Dr. Pruitt and Dr. Lal, that's a female who was also working with him, were trying to understand the genes that control the mustard weed's outer skin. As part of the project, they were studying mustard plants that had a mutated gene where the plant's petals and other floral organs clumped together. We're going to see what that looks like in just a second here. Because each of the plant's 2 copies of the gene were mutated from both of their parents, they had no chance of having normal offspring. It was impossible. But yet, up to 10% of the plant's offspring kept reverting to normal, and this occurred over many, many, many scientific trials. 1 out of 10 of these plants that has got corrupted DNA heals its own DNA. And that's great for guys like Monsanto, in which, there's one finger on my hand that I'm probably going to want to use if I wanted to gesture for them, and it's not this, okay? When they create Terminator seeds that don't ever grow again, you can't really mess with nature that much. What we see is that even these types of mutations that damage the DNA, 10% heals spontaneously. And they're going crazy trying to figure out what the heck this is, because they're testing both the parents. They test, they retest. There's no way that those damaged genes should fix themselves. The code is not there in the DNA. It doesn't exist. That's why these top guys from California Institute of Technology and Harvard are saying this is really freaking weird. We don't know what the heck is going on. How does this happen? How is this information going back into the DNA from somewhere else? When the researchers analyzed the mutated gene known as hothead, which is just HTH, that's the code name they gave for it, funny name, they found that the gene had changed with mutated DNA units being changed back to their normal form. So this is a picture from Pruitt's study of what the mutated mustard weed flowers look like. Now, notice that the bulbs are not nice and straight. There are these weird holes at the bottom of the bulb. You can see that very clearly. It almost looks like somebody popped a balloon. That's not supposed to be there. That means pollen is falling out. It's going to damage the plant. It's not going to be able to reproduce very well. It's clearly a bad thing. This is what a normal, healthy mustard weed looks like, where you see the flowers do not have holes in the bottom and everything's fine. Now what you're going to see is a quote from this same New York Times article that is so kind of iconic that I wanted to break it out on its own slide. Take a look. The finding poses a puzzle for evolutionary theory because it corrects mutations, which evolution supposedly depends on to generate novelty. So it's a little bit wordy, but the idea is, wait a minute. You're supposed to be saying from the Darwinian model that mutation causes evolution. But if mutations are always getting fixed by some mysterious force, then how could they ever do anything good? Mutations do not do anything good. That's the point. This model is flawed. Pruitt's discovery proves that. And that's why, once again, like I've been saying with all these other things, like Montagnier's discovery of DNA showing up in water, and then we had that top scientist, Reimer, saying this is going to force us to rewrite the last 90 years of science. It's the most incredible discovery in the last 90 years. We have to totally redo chemistry and biology and all these other things involving physics. So this is very compelling stuff, because what we're seeing is that we have to rethink everything we thought we knew. Here's another article about the same study in New Scientist entitled Mendel Upended. And of course, Mendelian genetics is this idea of how they determine whether you have dominant or recessive genes, whether you're going to have a kid with blue eyes or brown eyes, and you get your little Mendelian chart and you have certain genes that are going to be more powerful or less powerful. That's all gone in the garbage now. I mean, yes, it works. It's part of what's going on. But the simple fact that these flowers are mutating and then they're healing with no genetic component, it totally changes the game. The idea here is that life is spontaneously evolving when it is exposed to stress. This cannot be undermined, the significance of that statement. Stress obviously would include a mutation in this case, but there are other ways in which you can deliberately stress organisms that are not already mutated, and then you'll see something amazing happen. So another one of the basic organisms that is used in laboratory research is the simple roundworm with the name Caenorhabditis elegans. And that's a big mouthful, as you can see right here. That's how it's pronounced. Normally, this little roundworm is lactose intolerant. He doesn't like lactose, it will kill him. If you place him in a lactose-only environment, most of his little buddies will die. However, a small percentage of these roundworms survive. Well, wait a minute. They can't digest lactose. It's a poison to them. Their mouth isn't even built to be able to eat it properly. They literally starve to death. It's not food for them. How can they survive if lactose is the only food? The answer is somehow they spontaneously rewrite their own DNA. Evolution is occurring here on a very rapid, almost instantaneous scale in the presence of stress, as the worm spontaneously changes the shape of its mouth in order to be able to digest lactose. And get ready now for the gross out pictures. If you don't like worms, you might want to just, close your eyes. I don't know. It's not that bad, but I'm just saying. So here we go. This is your basic Caenorhabditis elegans. It only has a small number of cells. It's a very tiny, tiny microscopic organism. You can actually count the number of cells in its whole body, the number of cells in its gut, etc. And those mouths are touching there. This is a normal Caenorhabditis mouth, and you see how it has a certain shape. It almost kind of looks like a cactus, and you see there's kind of like triangular shape there. Now what happened is that this actual mouth mutated, and the shape of the mouth changed in one generation. A certain number of those worms were able to rewrite their own DNA. The actual shape of the mouth changed, and now they can eat lactose. Another one of the really weird scientific discoveries that is right along this line of what happened to the roundworm and what happened to the mustard weed is concerning Drosophila, which is the basic fruit fly. Once again, Drosophila is used in a majority of scientific experiments. It's a very tiny, very simple being with not too many cells. Its genetic code has been very thoroughly mapped. The DNA is thoroughly understood. And we know that there's a way to take out the code for the eyes and make them blind. So let's take a look at that. This is an up-close view of the Drosophila fly with its eyes normally intact. But in this research done in the labs, this again is the most frequently studied insect in science. You take a single fertilized cell that forms an embryo, so it's only one cell, and then you take away all of the DNA in its code that would make the eyes. So there's no way that it could have eyes. The fruit fly is then born without any eyes, just as you would expect. But then the really weird part is that even after you breed it with other fruit flies that have also had that DNA removed, they have no eyes. No matter how many times they do this, the eyes are automatically put back in, and it never takes more than a total of 5 generations for this to happen. So here on the left is the mutant version of the fruit fly, where the gene for its eyes have been removed and it's not there anymore. And then there on the right is the eyes as they normally would look. Nothing that they have ever been able to do has made flies without eyes stay that way. They always get their eyes back. But it's impossible in Mendelian genetics for that to happen because there's no code for those eyes. So this again shows they have to be drawing off of some kind of hidden template of information that makes those eyes energetically and then changes the structure of the DNA. So this again totally ruins the idea of Darwinian evolution because you can't get a mutation that's going to stick around. The life wants to stay the way it is. And then upgrading from one life to another is an intelligent process where new energy that makes a new life form retools the DNA of an existing species, just as we said. Yet another example of this idea of stress transforming an organism very quickly is in the case of the incredible story of the Italian wall lizard, which I did mention on this show once before. In only 36 years, they got a very intense evolutionary quantum leap from stress. So it started in 1971 when 5 adult pairs of this lizard, Podarcus sicula, were moved from their home island in the South Adriatic Sea to another island. Their home island was a desert where they ate small insects, and that was their main diet. Their new island was only vegetation for the most part, and they became vegetarians. Now here's the thing. Insects are very soft, they're very easy to crush with the jaws. Vegetation, plant material, has fiber, and it's much harder to chew. So it requires a stronger and bulkier jaw. So you have 5 adult breeding pairs moved from an island where they only need a weak, soft jaw, and they have a certain type of digestive system to digest insects, and then they're moved to an island with vegetation. None of these lizards had ever been on this island before. And what happened in only 36 years? It is amazing. The scientists came back to the island after 1971 in 2004, 5, and 6, and they found the descendants of these original species. They confirmed it was the same ones because they did DNA tests off the tail. They captured these lizards and they measured the size of their nasal passages, the snout vent, the size of their heads, and the overall weight of their bodies. Again, the DNA confirmed they were genetically identical to their original parents, and what they found is in only 36 years, there were striking differences in the size and shape of the head. They had much greater bite strength, and they actually developed new structures in their digestive system that could break down and digest plants. Now, if you know anything about food combining, you really don't want to ever blend together meat and grain, because that causes gas. Now, why is that happening? It's happening because your body needs different types of digestive secretions for meat than it does for grain. Meat is broken down by acid, whereas grain is broken down by other chemicals that are more basic. And what happens if you actually put acids and bases together? What happens if you blend vinegar and baking soda? If you're a geek like I was, you probably did this. You get all this effervescence, you get all this bubbling, right? So when you try to have two different types of food in your gut at the same time that are not really compatible in terms of how they're digested, you get that effervescence, which leads to gas, which is definitely unpleasant. So in the case of vegetation, to digest this harder starch, you actually have to be able to create fermentation in the gut. The problem is that these lizards do not have the ability to ferment anything in their gut. But wait, check this out. When those lizards were moved to the island Podmerkaru, in which they only had vegetation to eat and the insects were much harder to find, they developed cecal valves in their gut that actually create pockets where things can ferment. They never had this before. Take a look. Never before did they have these cecal valves, but when these little guys were autopsied, sure enough, their gut had formed a totally new organ that they never had before that ferments liquids and makes it so they can actually digest plants. And it was because they were put under stress and had to survive on an island that they never had before. So what you see here is different types of wall lizards, and notice just, for example, the difference between A and B. They had to bite a lot harder, so now they're bigger, their jaw is thicker, so you can imagine that just looking at the difference between them, that the head can get larger, the nose can get larger, the nasal passages, and these adaptive changes allowed them to eat plants. The other thing I find really cool about this is that when those lizards became vegetarians, their behavior changed. They stopped being so aggressive. When they were eating insects, they had aggressive behavior, would defend their own territory. Once they started eating plants, they worked as a community and they no longer would fight with each other. Maybe because they didn't have to compete, there was so much plant material everywhere that everybody was just very, very blissed out and happy. So that's really interesting. And all of these facts relate to human beings, because remember, our DNA is very similar to other things in our genetic environment. We are not as dissimilar as we think. Even that roundworm, Caenorhabditis elegans, it has about the same number of genes as we do. So does the mustard weed. So this is a very interesting fact. If stress can make the roundworm able to digest lactose where it normally couldn't, if the mustard weed has a bad mutation and it fixes itself 10% of the time, if the fruit fly puts its eyes back on after only 5 generations in every case, and if the wall lizard is moved to a totally different island with totally different food, it's able to evolve its whole digestive system and its mouth and its head and its jaw muscles and everything. That also has huge implications for human evolution. What is happening to us as we go through these evolutionary changes? Well, this is one of the articles that really started to jump into my field of view. I'd already written Source Field by this point. 2011 is when it came out. And then Daily Mail has this thing that says, why aliens might look like you. DNA could be a universal constant, making humans and ETs closer to being cousins. So this is one of those examples of drip, drip, drip disclosure where they're saying, you know, maybe DNA is the same throughout the universe and maybe everybody's human. Well, they already know. So they put things like this out to get us ready for the big disclosure in the future. The human being is a universal phenomenon, at least in our galaxy, and according to what's in the Law of One, it's apparently 40% of all intelligent life in the entire universe has a human or humanoid appearance in some way. So that's very, very interesting and very cool. DNA could be a universal constant. It's not just me saying this, it's mainstream science. But how is our DNA changing? Are there proofs that we are evolving. One of the most compelling ones is what's called the Flynn effect. And this was discovered by a scientist from New Zealand, as you can see here, named Dr. James Flynn. And he is one of the leading experts in the world studying human intelligence. He's a professor emeritus of political studies and psychology at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand, and he's among the very top scholars in the world studying human intelligence. He discovered that we are having an overall increase in our IQ of 3 points over the course of each decade, going back to the 1800s at least. Now, this is an article from New York Times, dated from November 2012, and it's called IQ Rising. And here it is. When the social scientist James Flynn started analyzing more than 50 years worth of IQ scores, he noticed something peculiar. On tests that assessed vocabulary used in everyday life, adults showed enormous gains, nearly 18 points. So this is very cool stuff here. And again, here's I broke it down for you just to get to the point and highlight it. An 18-point IQ gain in just over 50 years. Now, he's ruled out all the other variables that could account for this. It's a very mysterious overall increase in human intelligence, and we don't have any conventional explanation for this. So here's some excerpts from the New York Times on what he said. IQ gains over time pose interesting questions about American society, Mr. Flynn said, speaking from his home in Otago, New Zealand. And this is one of the most interesting. How is this IQ happening? How is this IQ changing? After uncovering one of the most intriguing mysteries surrounding intelligence research, that each generation has significantly higher IQ scores than the previous one, he has spent more than 25 years trying to explain why. Now, of course, in Flynn's view, our IQ is changing due to a changing environment, and we're adapting to stress. And that could be true, because I just said these other organisms, when they're put in a stressful environment, their IQ is changing. But let's now look at a summary of the Flynn effect, which has been around for a long time, and he's still out there lecturing on this. We've had an average IQ increase of 3 points per decade. This has been studied in over 20 different countries. He was very meticulous, and the change has continued unabated for over 100 years. It has never gone down. It's only increasing. And interestingly enough, the increase is the most striking for tests measuring our ability to recognize abstract nonverbal patterns. And this amounts to a cultural renaissance. So again, he doesn't really understand, in my opinion, maybe that's arrogant for me to say that, but I don't feel that he really understands what's going on here. He's not seeing the possibility that this could be like the frog to salamander effect, where frog eggs transform into something else, or like what happened with the rat's tail turning into a cat, or like what happened with chicken eggs turning into ducks. What I'm saying is that there's an energy that is actually transforming our IQ. We're moving into that higher energy. The solar system is charging up. All of this fits. And what if there was a physiological marker of our IQ increase as well? Could we study the body itself and see evidence that the brain size is going up? Well, the answer is yes. And once again, the article comes to us, in this case, from the Daily Mail, where they have a very cheeky headline here. Americans' heads are getting bigger. You can see how much they like Americans. In just 150 years, the volume of the average skull has grown by the size of a tennis ball. And it says a survey of 1,500 skulls from the mid-1800s to 1980s. The overall volume of the skull has risen by the size of a tennis ball. Our faces are becoming longer and narrower. So the guy who did all this work is Dr. Richard Jantz. And here's a good picture of him. And here's another picture of him where he's actually working on a skull, just so you get the sense of what Dr. Jantz is doing. And here's some excerpts from that article. Within just 150 years, American heads have grown in volume by roughly the volume of a tennis ball. That is a very significant amount. The survey of 1,500 skulls compared skulls from the mid-1800s to skulls from the 1980s, and their shape is definitely changing. Now, this is from Jantz, and again, his name is Lee. He uses the name Lee in this case. It's not his real first name, but that's what he wants to be called. The varieties of changes that have swept American life make determining an exact cause an endlessly complicated proposition, said Lee Jantz. The researchers found that the average height from the base to the top of the skull in men has increased by 0.3 inches. That's a very significant amount. The skull size has grown by 200 cubic centimeters, a space equivalent to a tennis ball. I almost didn't want to put this in because some sexists are going to use this, but in women, the corresponding increases are 7 millimeters and 180 cubic centimeters, so a little bit less. Maybe that's because women were already smarter. Okay, let's just try that one out. But the point is, everybody is increasing, the brain volume is going up in a very dramatic fashion. Skull height, the overall height of the skull has increased 6.8% since the late 1800s. That's amazing. While body height has increased 5.6%. So the skull is growing faster than the body, and the length of the femur, which would lead to your height going up, has only increased by 2%. So the skull is growing disproportionately to the rest of the body. Well, that's very, very strange. Why would the head be growing faster than the rest of the body? Well, why is our IQ going up by 3 points per decade for over 100 years, according to Dr. Flynn? You see, I believe these two things are interrelated. We're actually getting larger heads, we're getting larger brains. Our IQ is going up because we are spontaneously evolving. And there is also stress. The stress of our environment, the stress of Earth changes, is forcing us to think of ways to survive. We're looking at all these problems happening. We're looking at the discovery of the Federal Reserve System in America in 1913, where the dollar value has gone down by almost 99% thanks to inflation. We have stress of seeing fascism, World War I, World War II, all of this crazy stuff politically going on. Earth changes, climate change, typhoons, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, massive wars, the threat of a nuclear holocaust. These changes are stressing us just like the wall lizard was stressed when he goes to the island that only has vegetables. Just like the roundworm when he's dropped into the lactose environment where there's nothing else. So what's happening to us? These stresses are causing us to evolve. Our heads are getting larger, our IQ is going up. Just a couple more slides on this and then we're done. Scientists also noted changes that illustrate our population is maturing sooner. This is reflected in the earlier closing of a separation in the bone structure of the skull called the spheno-occipital synchondrosis, which in the past was thought to fuse at about age 20. Richard Jansen and Natalie Shirley, an adjunct assistant professor in the FAC, have found that now the bone is fusing much earlier than age 20, average of age 14 for girls and 16 for boys. So this is absolutely amazing stuff because what it's fundamentally doing is rewriting what we thought we knew about ourselves. And that's only the beginning of the amazing evidence suggesting spontaneous human evolution is happening now. We're going to have a lot more of that stunning information in the next episode of Wisdom Teachings, bringing you the information you need that will set you free. I'm David Wilcock, and I thank you for watching.